Okay, thank you.
Here are some problems to try for extra credit that also made look like problems on the second midterm. So this is like a study guide to the second midterm. The second midterm would cover any chapters since the first midterm and probably chapters 19 through 21 on monetary theory. So you can get 20 points of extra credit for each of these problems. So let's begin with chapter 19 that delineates the quantity theory of exchange. So you may remember a relationship between spending and income. Here is the money supply, the number of tenge in Kazakhstan, the M, times velocity, which is the number of times that a tenge is spent and respent over the economy. Spending is equal to income. Income is nominal GDP, or the price level, which you can think of as being like the price of the typical basket of goods in Kazakhstan times output. So if I write that out, N is the money supply, number of tenge, V is the turnover rate of velocity. So for example, if we spend each tenge twice in the economy, our velocity is 2. P is the price level, which you can think of as the average price in Kazakhstan over all goods and services, or think of it as the price of a typical bundle. And then choose its output, or the number of bundles produced. Okay, so we can rewrite this expression in terms of logarithms, might be helpful. The log of n plus the log of v. Remember that for a product, the logarithms can be added across the terms in the product. And the same for the price level and also for output, where LG represents a natural log. Okay, so far. So remember from calculus that the change in the log of a number, we call it the log of x, with respect to x is equal to 1 over x. So if we treat the derivative as the ratio of a couple of changes as a differential, then we can write the change in the log of x as dx over x. So all that I've done here is to multiply both sides of the equation by dx, the change in x. But this is very useful because we now have an expression for the relative change or the rate of change in x. So going back to our quoted equation 1, we can differentiate all variables on both sides. So we have the change in the natural log of m plus the change in the natural log of v is equal to the change in the log of p and the change in the log of q. But remember that the change in the natural log is equal to the relative change in that variable. So we have the rate of change in m plus the rate of change in volatility, velocity, equal to the rate of change in prices and the rate of change in Q. So you don't need to memorize the derivation. Don't worry about that. I just wanted to show you the intuition, the logic behind this final expression, which says that the relative changes on both sides of the equation are the same. Okay. Well, note that the rate of change in the price level is the rate of inflation. And suppose that velocity is stable, it does not change, so that the rate of change in velocity is zero, and also suppose that there is no change in output because they are already at the equilibrium level of full employment. In other words, they're already using all our machines and workers as efficiently as we can. So this means that the rate of change in money, and then we'll insert the rate of change in velocity, which is zero, the rate of inflation, and then the rate of change in output also zero. So this means that there is a direct relationship between the rate of increase in pay and the rate of inflation in Kazakhstan. So I will stop there and go back to the problem. Velocity is constant and output is constant as well. And we observe that the supply of piggy is rising 10% per year. So can you predict the long-run rate of inflation using the fluidity theory of exchange? Well, let's see. here is the problem. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
Okay. So if the money supply is rising 10% per year, what happens to inflation? Remembering that we had assumed that velocity is constant and output is constant as well. So there is a direct relationship between money and prices. So if the money supply is rising to 10%, then from our expression right here, that sets to zero the rate of change in velocity and output. Since if we had 10% plus zero equal to the rate of change in prices, and assuming no change in
Or
output.
zero. Yes.
So what is the rate of inflation that you
So
would predict? 10%.
10%. 10%. Yes. So if inflation, if the money supply rising by 10% per year, the long run rate of inflation, 10%. Yes.
Yes, that's
Will
right.
be.
Yes, in the long run, yeah.
In the long run, yes.
That's a good point to make, because really our assumption about the constant values for velocity and output is more likely to hold in the long run rather than the short run. Good. Okay, so that takes care of chapter 19. So let's take a look now at chapters 20 and 21 in terms of the ISLM model. Now, in chapter 21, the test for this is just a bit differently than I'm going to do for right now. But the shift is not very important. I'm going to use the ISLM model first because I think it will make it easier to understand what Michigan is talking about. Okay, so we are trying to stimulate the economy that has been punished by lockdowns, and we will stimulate the economy by spending more money to the government and also by printing more money through the central bank, the national bank. So both policies are accommodative. And the question is to predict what will happen in Kazakhstan to the interest rate adjusted for inflation and also in output. So let's take a look at the IS curve. In terms of output and investment. And in terms of output and the interest rate, which will affect investment. remember that we can express output of GDP, real GDP, in terms of who is buying what. Our production is purchased by
Consumption
consumers,
plus inputs.
households like you and I, by firms that are investing
Net
in order
exports.
to expand their plants, for example, or their inventory.
Mm-hmm.
Government spending on goods and services, we exclude transfer payments because the transfer payment does not affect production. And then net exports. Okay, so we assume that investment relates negatively to the interest rate. By investment, I mean real investment, expanding factories, for example. Because a higher interest rate makes business loans more expensive. And then net exports also are called as export minus imports. Net exports also relate negatively to the real interest rate. Why? But you move. Uh-huh.
If interest rate increase,
Okay.
so import will be bigger than export.
If the interest rate rises, just exports will fall and imports will rise. But why?
Yes, so net export is becomes negative.
Or more negative than before. Just it may still be a positive number, but it will be smaller than before. Yes. But why? So let's see. Suppose that the interest rate rises in Kazakhstan, then people will want to buy Kazakhstani assets since they pay at the higher rate of return than before. So demand increases for KZ assets, which will raise the demand for the tenge, since you have to have the tenge to buy the assets, like a bond from the government in Miss Wilson. Since people now are bidding more dollars for the tenge than before, the tenge will strengthen. That is, it's dollar value will rise. For example, the exchange rate may fall from, what is it today, maybe 430 per dollar to 220 per dollar. So this means that the ticket becomes more expensive in terms of dollars than before. So a couple of things happen. The ticket becomes more expensive for foreigners. They have to pay more dollars to get the ticket than before. So Pakistani exports will fall. And what about imports? What happens to imports?
Imports increase.
Good. Did you say decrease?
Increase.
But you're right, but why are you correct? Dollars become less expensive than before.
Yes. So for foreigners, the as tenge depreciates, yes.
The tenge appreciates.
Appreciates.
Because
So
more valuable, more expensive to foreigners. But you and I, of course, studies, we are holding tenge. Now, the tenge is worth more dollars than it had been before. So, for us, the dollar becomes cheaper. So, our demand for imports into Pakistan, which are expressed in dollars, will increase. Software, high definition TV, whatever, people find it cheaper to buy those goods from other countries than had been the case before. So let's say exports will fall, imports will rise. So net exports from Kazakhstan will
decrease.
decrease because of the higher interest rate. So the reasoning is a bit roundabout, but the information is that a higher interest rate in Kazakhstan will make our currency or tenge more attractive and assets that are expressed in tenge more attractive for foreigners to buy. Therefore, the tenge appreciates, becomes stronger, and the appreciation will decrease goods that are expressed in tenge and increase demand in Kazakhstan for goods that are expressed in dollars. The higher interest rate will reduce net exports from Kazakhstan. So let's summarize all of that. A higher interest rate in Kazakhstan will lower investment because firms find it more expensive to borrow money to build their plants. And it will also lower net exports by making the tenge more expensive for foreigners to buy than before. However, investment and net exports are both part of GDP. So there is a negative relationship between output and the real interest rate. So there is what miscontrols the GIS curve. Relates negatively in terms of output to the interest rate. Okay, good. So IS expresses the real sector, so-called. By real, meaning physical goods of computers, coffee, and so forth. Now, to complete a model of the economy, we will need the non-real sector. And by non-real, I just mean financial. And then we will have a complete model for the economy, be taken into account both sectors. So that's the idea behind the LM curve that we talked about before in terms of the ultimate economy, that is in terms of an economy that is open to trade around the world. At this time, we will assume that there is no trade between Pakistan and other countries. We will assume that everything bought and sold occurs in the borders of Pakistan. We have a closed economy. Or to make this a more reasonable assumption, let's assume that purchases and sales of the tenge are occurring in Kazakhstan. And also, we have an equilibrium between money supply and money demand, which is the most important assumption right now for the LM curve. Okay, so before when we had talked about the open economy, we had assumed that Kazakhstan will adopt the world interest rate. In other words, Kazakhstan is so small relative to the rest of the world that it has no impact on the world interest rate. Now, this time, we will assume that the interest rate can change in Kazakhstan. So, the central bank will set the money supply and the money demand, you remember, is a function of the interest rate and also of output, according to income. As we become richer, we demand more money because we want to spend more. We want it available to us for impulsive shopping, perhaps. And as the interest rate rises, in Kazakhstan, so we will spend money to buy assets that pay off at that higher rate of return, the higher interest rate. So our demand to hold money, not to spend it, but to hold money, will fall. There is a positive impact of output on the demand to hold money. And a negative impact in terms of the real interest rate. Okay, so far. So here is the Elvin curve.
Mm-hmm.
So you remember this from a discussion before. You remember that we assume all along the Elvin schedule that money supply is a constant. For example, 3 trillion tenge. Since money supply is a constant, money demand on the schedule has got to be constant as well. If money supply is 3 trillion tenge, money demand is also 3 trillion tenge. And you remember that we said that as income is rising, this is its output. When income rises, money demand will rise as well. So, for example, at this point right here, given the interest rate, we have higher output at this point than we had on the L1 schedule. There it is. As we move from A to B, these 2 points, many of the men go wise because they have higher income at B than at A. But that means that we will be out of equilibrium when demand is higher than money supply.
Mhm.
So to return to equilibrium, we must raise the interest rate. Going from the in vertical fashion to a point right here. At point C, we return to equilibrium. Money demand again equals money supply. Okay, so here's what for you to try. Suppose that we begin at point D on the other schedule, and then for some reason we have a rise in the interest rate, so that we are moving to point E. Okay, so what happens now at E? Do we have equilibrium between money demand and money supply? But remember that when the interest rate rises, money
Interest rate
demand,
rises, yes.
say again, sounds good.
Yes, interest rate rises,
Uh-huh.
but output remains the same.
No,
Yes,
no,
as at point D.
but I'm not much of an artist, but I'm trying to draw these 2 points so that they're on the same vertical line. In other
Mhm.
words, output is the same at point E as at point D.
Mhm.
The only change is that the interest rate is higher at E rather than at D.
Yes.
So what happens now at point E? Money supply has not changed. We still have 3 trillion tenge,
Mhm.
but money demand may change. How? How does money demand change as we go from D to E? Interest rate is higher. So money demand will
Money
fall.
decrease, yes. Mhm.
Since we don't want
But
the
money supply is the same, yes?
exactly good.
Uh-huh.
So now we have at E, but is it excess money or deficiency of money?
Excess?
Correct. Money demand has
Excess?
fallen. Go ahead.
At E, excess of money?
Excess of money. Or deficient money demand. So given that interest rate, what has got to happen to bring us back into equilibrium? We've got to raise
Yeah, decrease
output.
decrease interest rate we should.
But we will assume that the interest rate is a given. So we'll call that 7%. We assume now that the new real interest rate will hold. That rate is not going to change. The output may change. If we increase output, then what happens to money demand? Output or income. If income rises, people demand to hold more money. As we move from E to F.
Some money demand will rise.
Good, exactly, yeah.
And money demand will is greater than money supply.
Exactly, yeah. Money supply is a given. It's always free to in the story. So money demand has to rise to bring us back to equilibrium. Good. Okay, so that takes care of the dynamics of the LM schedule, which is just a monetary market. That's all it is. So now I'm going to clean this up a little bit. Okay, so here's the situation. We have a rise in government spending and a rise in money supply. And then we want to put the two events together to determine what is happening overall to the national economy. If the government spends more money, will that affect IS or LM? Remembering that the IS is representing the real sector that is the purchase goods and services. And LM represents the money markets. money is not real because it does not represent value in a physical way. The real is a technical term for economists, not philosophy. Remember that GDP is the real sector, and that includes purchases for the government.
IS will shift to the right.
Good, exactly. Good. So there is the new IS curve. So what happens so far to output in the real interest rate?
It increased.
The both increase, yes, good. So the interest rate rises and output rises as well, good. But the story, the real story in Kazakhstan is a bit more complicated than that. We have not only a rise in government spending, but also the creation of Botegi for the National Bank. So now, does this second event affect IS or LM?
LM.
Good.
If money supply rises,
Good.
LM curve shifts.
Exactly. Good. And which does it shift?
I think to the right, yes.
Shifts to the right? Is that right? So there is LM prime. So why is that reasonable? Why would we rule out the possibility that an increase in the number of Tegi would shift LM to the left? Why is that not reasonable?
So at new equilibrium,
good.
So there is new equilibrium, and output decreases. Well, and interest rate decreases as well. Output increases and interest rate decreases.
Increases. If we're shifting to the left, then output falls and the interest rate rises for any level. But no, you're correct that when money supply rises, we have to move to the right rather than to the left of the LM schedule. That's correct. Because we now have more money supply than before. We have 4 trillion Tegi rather than 3 trillion. So somehow we have got to increase money demand by another trillion Tegi. That can happen if we increase output or go ahead.
Increase interest rate.
Did you say increase
or decrease? Decrease interest rate.
Decrease. Reduce. Yeah, good. In other words, you could think of a shift of L11 as moving in this direction, moving down, because the movement down connotes a lower interest rate driven output. So, our story is correct. We could increase money demand either by raising income for a given interest rate or by lowering the interest rate for a given level of output. Good. Okay, so if we ignore IS for a minute, what is the consequence of our increase in money supply? So let's think about it in terms of IS right here. If we are going from A to B, output rises and the real interest rate
Decreases.
will fall.
Mm-hmm.
From A to B, good. So down here in this diagram, we have the many voices of the voices, and the impact of that one shift, only the shift of LM, is that the interest rate will fall and output will rise. Okay, so now let's put both events together. That is the overall change in output and the real interest rate. If we can determine what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But let's
Real
see.
interest rate remains the same, yes,
Yes, the
and
interest
output increase.
output increases, yes, but the interest rate is indeterminate. It could rise or it could fall, depending on whether the IS shift is larger than the LM shift.
Mm-hmm.
So the total position is that output will rise, and the interest rate is unknown, without new information about the relative shifts of IS and LM. So there it is. Maybe the government and the national bank would be doing the right thing if they're really concerned more with output than with interest rates. Okay, good. So I think you have earned plenty extra credit points for that discussion.
Thank
Now here's just one more before we stop for tonight, unless you have more questions. And here is the scenario this time that the National Bank is worried, and really is worried to some degree, about inflation, now 7%, and maybe rising because people seem to have higher expectations of inflation. So, the National Bank reduces the money supply to try to bring spending and therefore prices down. What happens now? In output.
If National Bank reduces the money supply, so LM curves shift to the left.
Good.
And output decreases, interest rate increases. So at new equilibrium, output fall, and interest rate rises.
Good. So we have a recession, partly because firms cannot afford to take out loans when the interest rate has risen so much. But perhaps that fall in investment will reduce the pressure on prices, so maybe it will help reduce inflation at the expense of a recession. Okay, so that is good for plenty introductory credit as well. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.